Second Treatise of Government by John Locke quotes, Second Treatise of Government by John Locke is a landmark work in political philosophy, originally published in 1690, to justify the constitutional revolution in England that ousted King James II. Locke presents a detailed theory of government that contrasts the absolute monarchy with a system of limited, consensual authority rooted in natural law and the rights of individuals. He outlines key concepts such as the state of nature, the social contract, and the idea that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Locke's arguments in favor of personal liberty, private property, and the right to resist tyrannical rule have had profound influence on modern democratic thought, and played a pivotal role in shaping the political ideals of the Enlightenment and the American Revolution. Quote 1. Political power, then, I take to be a right of making laws with penalties of death, and consequently all less penalties for the regulating and preserving of property, and of employing the force of the community, in the execution of such laws, and in the defense of the commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good. This quote highlights John Locke's definition of political power, emphasizing its role in creating and enforcing laws to protect property and maintain societal order. Locke argues that political power is meant to serve the public good by ensuring the security of the community, both from internal violations and external threats. It suggests that true governance is based on the consent of the governed, with laws crafted to benefit all rather than serve private interests. Quote 2. To understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is, a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. Locke is describing the state of nature in this passage, where individuals are born free and equal, possessing the liberty to govern their own actions and use their property without interference. He asserts that people inherently have the right to make their own decisions, bound only by the natural law that governs fairness and reason. This is a foundational concept in Locke's political philosophy, serving as a starting point for his arguments on government and individual rights. Quote 3. A state also of equality, wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another, there being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature and the use of the same faculties, should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection. Here, Locke argues that all people are naturally equal, possessing the same faculties and deserving of the same opportunities. He dismisses any inherent hierarchy among humans unless divinely ordained, insisting that no person has the right to rule over another by birth or nature. This notion of equality is essential to Locke's ideas on political power and governance, as it underpins the necessity of consent and fairness in forming governments. Quote 4. This equality of men by nature, the judicious Hooker looks upon as so evident in itself, and beyond all question, that he makes it the foundation of that obligation to mutual love amongst men, on which he builds the duties they owe one another, and from whence he derives the great maxims of justice and charity. Locke references Richard Hooker to reinforce his belief in natural equality as the basis for societal obligations such as justice and charity. He explains that the recognition of equality compels people to treat one another with mutual respect and care, as they would expect in return. This quote highlights Locke's belief that societal duties arise naturally from the shared condition of human equality, forming the moral foundation for laws and governance. Quote 5. Though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license, though man in that state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself, or so much as any creature in his possession. but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. Locke distinguishes the concept of liberty in the state of nature from unrestricted freedom, clarifying that even in a state of liberty, there are natural laws that bind individuals. People are free to govern themselves and their property, but not to the extent of self-destruction or causing unnecessary harm to others. This implies that freedom is tempered by reason and the obligation to preserve life and property unless a higher purpose requires otherwise. Quote 6. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Locke outlines that even in the absence of formal government, individuals are governed by the law of nature, which is grounded in reason. This law dictates that people are inherently equal and must respect each other's rights to life, liberty, and property. The quote emphasizes the moral responsibility of individuals to treat others fairly and justly, driven by rational understanding rather than the imposition of external authority. Quote 7. Everyone, as he is bound to preserve himself, and not to quit his station willfully, so by the like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind. In this quote, Locke explains the principle of self-preservation, noting that individuals have a duty to protect their own lives. However, this responsibility extends beyond the self. When one's survival is not at risk, there is an obligation to aid in preserving the lives of others. The moral implication here is that communal welfare is a shared duty, grounded in the same natural laws that guide individual preservation. Quote 8. The execution of the law of nature is, in that state, put into every man's hands, whereby everyone has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. Locke asserts that in the state of nature, individuals are not only responsible for following natural law, but also for enforcing it. Each person has the right to punish those who violate the law of nature to prevent further harm. This concept of individual enforcement is crucial to Locke's vision of justice in the absence of formal government, underscoring the collective role in maintaining order. Quote 9. And thus, in the state of nature, one man comes by a power over another, but yet no absolute or arbitrary power to use a criminal when he has got him in his hands according to the passionate heats or boundless extravagancy of his own will. Locke explains that even in the state of nature, when one individual has power over another, that power is not absolute. The punishment of criminals must be proportionate and guided by reason, rather than personal vengeance or unrestrained will. This idea reinforces Locke's broader argument that justice, even in a natural state, must be fair and governed by rational principles rather than emotion or desire. Quote 10. The state of war is a state of enmity and destruction, and therefore declaring by word or action not a passionate and hasty, but a sedate, settled design upon another man's life, puts him in a state of war with him against whom he has declared such an intention. Locke defines the state of war as one where an individual, through deliberate and considered actions, threatens the life of another. This premeditated intent to harm creates a condition of war between the two parties. Locke asserts that it is justifiable for the threatened individual to defend themselves, even to the extent of destroying the aggressor, as preservation of life is paramount in the law of nature. Quote 11. He who attempts to get another man into his absolute power does thereby put himself into a state of war with him, it being to be understood as a declaration of a design upon his life. Locke argues that any attempt to subjugate another person by force or coercion places the aggressor in a state of war with the one they seek to dominate. The underlying implication is that such an attempt indicates a desire to strip the individual of their freedom, which Locke sees as tantamount to a threat to their life. Freedom and life are so intertwined that an attack on liberty is considered an attack on existence itself. Quote 12. This makes it lawful for a man to kill a thief, who has not in the least hurt him, nor declared any design upon his life, any farther than, by the use of force, so to get him in his power as to take away his money, or what he pleases, from him. Locke expands the concept of self-defense to include situations where an individual uses force to rob or subdue another. Even if the aggressor has not directly threatened the victim's life, the mere act of using force creates a situation where the victim cannot trust that their life will not be in danger later. Thus, Locke justifies preemptive self-defense in such situations as a lawful act within the state of war. Quote 13. Men living together according to reason, without a common superior on earth, with authority to judge between them, is properly the state of nature. But force, or a declared design of force, upon the person of another, where there is no common superior on earth to appeal to for relief, is the state of war. Locke differentiates between the state of nature and the state of war by highlighting that in the state of nature, people can live harmoniously based on reason and equality. However, when force is introduced and there is no higher authority to mediate or provide justice, the state of nature transforms into a state of war. The absence of a common superior makes self-defense the only recourse in such conflicts. Quote 14. Want of a common judge with authority puts all men in a state of nature. Force without right, upon a man's person, makes a state of war, both where there is, and is not, a common judge. Locke asserts that the absence of an authority to mediate disputes returns people to a state of nature, but the introduction of force, especially without just cause, immediately creates a state of war. Even in societies with established authorities, if those authorities fail to provide justice or protection, individuals are thrust back into a condition of self-defense, making war inevitable when force is applied unjustly. Quote 15. Freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to every one of that society, and made by the legislative power erected in it, a liberty to follow my own will in all things, where the rule prescribes not, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. Here, Locke contrasts natural liberty with the liberty that exists within society. He explains that even within a governed society, true freedom means living under a set of consistent laws created by the collective will, rather than being subject to the arbitrary whims of a ruler. This underscores Locke's belief that laws should be predictable and apply equally to all, ensuring that individual freedom is maintained within a structured society. Quote 16. This freedom from absolute arbitrary power is so necessary to, and closely joined with, a man's preservation, that he cannot part with it, but by what forfeits his preservation and life together. Locke argues that the freedom from arbitrary power is essential to human preservation. No individual can willingly submit to another's absolute power without endangering their life and well-being. This reflects Locke's firm stance against slavery and absolute monarchies, where submission to such power undermines the very essence of self-preservation and liberty. Quote 17. No body can give more power than he has himself, and he that cannot take away his own life cannot give another power over it. Locke explains the principle that no one has the right to transfer more power to another than they possess. Since individuals do not have the right to take their own lives, they cannot grant someone else the authority to end their lives either. This reinforces Locke's argument against absolute power or slavery, where one's life is placed in the hands of another. Quote 18. This is the perfect condition of slavery, which is nothing else, but the state of war continued, between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Locke defines slavery as a prolonged state of war, where a conqueror continues to exercise power over a captive. However, this power is not absolute unless there is no agreement between them. If a compact is made, it transitions from slavery to a form of servitude with agreed limits. Thus, Locke emphasizes that slavery, in its truest sense, is sustained through the absence of mutual consent and remains akin to a state of war. Quote 19. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Locke asserts that individuals inherently own their bodies and, by extension, the labor they produce. This labor, being tied directly to the person, gives them exclusive rights over what they create or cultivate. It forms the basis for Locke's theory of property, emphasizing that ownership arises when personal effort transforms common resources. Quote 20. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. In this passage, Locke explains how labor transforms common goods into private property. By exerting effort to extract or modify resources from their natural state, individuals infuse them with their labor, thus claiming ownership. This transformation is what separates the common from the private, establishing the right to property through personal contribution. Quote 21. Labor put a distinction between them and common. That added something to them more than nature, the common mother of all, had done. And so, they became his private right. Locke emphasizes that it is labor that distinguishes what is common from what is privately owned. Through effort and work, individuals add value to natural resources, which in turn grants them the exclusive right to those resources. This principle reinforces the idea that labor is the key to creating property rights. Quote 22. As much as anyone can make use of to any advantage of life before it spoils, so much he may by his labor fix a property in. Whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. Locke introduces a natural limitation on property acquisition. Individuals may claim as much as they can use, but no more. If resources are hoarded and allowed to spoil, the individual is in violation of the natural law, as the excess should have been left for others. This prevents overaccumulation and ensures fair distribution of resources among all. Quote 23. It is labor, then, which puts the greatest part of value upon land, without which it would scarcely be worth anything. It is to that we owe the greatest part of all its useful products. Locke argues that labor is the primary source of value for land. Without human effort, through cultivation, improvement, and management, land in its natural state holds little worth. The fruits of the earth, which are crucial for human life, only become abundant and valuable when labor is applied to them. Quote 24. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. Locke describes natural liberty as the state where individuals are free from human-imposed authority, subject only to the law of nature. In this state, people are guided by reason and moral principles, not by the arbitrary will of others. This emphasizes Locke's belief in inherent freedom and self-governance, where individuals are bound only by the natural laws that protect their rights. Quote 25. The power, then, that parents have over their children arises from that duty which is incumbent on them to take care of their offspring during the imperfect state of childhood. Locke explains that parental power stems from the responsibility to care for and guide children during their formative years. Parents hold authority not as absolute rulers, but as caretakers responsible for educating and nurturing their children until they reach maturity and can reason independently. This temporary authority is rooted in the duty to protect and develop the child's mind and body. Quote 26. Children, I confess, are not born in this full state of equality, though they are born to it. Their parents have a sort of rule and jurisdiction over them when they come into the world, and for some time after. But it is but a temporary one. Locke acknowledges that children are born into a state of subordination but are destined for equality. The authority that parents exercise over their children is temporary, lasting only until the children grow in understanding and can take charge of their own lives. This reflects the view that all individuals, once matured, are equal in rights and freedoms. Quote 27. The freedom of a man at years of discretion and the subjection of a child to his parents, whilst yet short of that age, are so consistent and so distinguishable that the most blinded contenders for monarchy, by right of fatherhood, cannot miss this difference. Locke argues that there is a clear distinction between the authority exercised by parents over children and the freedom individuals enjoy once they reach maturity. He critiques the argument that political power should be derived from paternal authority, pointing out that parental authority is limited and temporary, whereas political governance must be based on different principles. Quote 28. The father's empire then ceases, and he can from thenceforwards no more dispose of the liberty of his son than that of any other man. Locke states that parental authority ends when the child reaches maturity, at which point the father no longer holds control over the son's life, liberty, or property. Once the child is capable of self-governance, they are independent and free just like any other adult. This highlights Locke's rejection of the idea of perpetual parental or monarchical rule over individuals. Quote 29. God having made man such a creature, that in his own judgment it was not good for him to be alone, put him under strong obligations of necessity, convenience and inclination to drive him into society. Locke asserts that human beings are naturally inclined to live in society due to both practical needs and their innate social nature. Humans are designed to seek companionship and mutual benefit, which leads them to form social bonds and communities. This drive toward society is essential for fulfilling their needs and ensuring their survival. Quote 30. Man being born, as has been proved, with a title to perfect freedom and an uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the law of nature, equally with any other man, or number of men in the world, hath by nature a power, not only to preserve his property, that is, his life, liberty, and estate, against the injuries and attempts of other men, but to judge of and punish the breaches of that law in others. Locke emphasizes that every person is born with the right to freedom and the ability to protect their life, liberty, and property according to the law of nature. In the absence of formal government, individuals have the authority to enforce natural law and punish wrongdoers to maintain justice. This natural power is fundamental in the state of nature, where individuals must act as their own judges and protectors. Quote 31. Wherever any number of men are so united into one society as to quit everyone his executive power of the law of nature, and to resign it to the public, there and there only is a political or civil society. Locke explains that civil society is formed when individuals voluntarily give up their personal right to enforce natural law and transfer it to a collective authority. By doing so, they establish a political society where a common government is responsible for maintaining order and adjudicating disputes. This mutual agreement allows society to function under established laws rather than personal judgment. Quote 32. Absolute monarchy, which by some men is counted the only government in the world, is indeed inconsistent with civil society, and so can be no form of civil government at all. Locke argues that absolute monarchy is incompatible with true civil society because it lacks the fundamental principle of mutual accountability. In a civil society, all individuals, including the rulers, must be subject to laws and have the ability to appeal for justice. In an absolute monarchy, where the ruler has unchecked power, citizens are essentially in a state of nature, without the protections and fairness that civil society offers. Quote 33. For wherever any persons are who have not such an authority to appeal to, for the decision of any difference between them, there those persons are still in the state of nature. Locke highlights that the absence of a common authority to resolve disputes indicates a state of nature. In such a condition, individuals are left to fend for themselves without the security and structure provided by civil society. This lack of an impartial authority to mediate conflicts means that true justice cannot be consistently upheld, leaving people vulnerable to the dangers of the natural state. Quote 34. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another. Locke explains that individuals give up their natural freedom voluntarily by agreeing to form a society. The motivation for this is the desire for security, peace, and protection of property. Civil society is thus created by mutual consent, where people collectively decide to submit to laws and governance in exchange for the benefits of organized community life. Quote 35. When any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated and make one body politic, wherein the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest. Locke asserts that once people agree to form a political community, the majority's decision becomes binding on all. This is essential for maintaining unity and allowing the community to act as a single entity. Without this principle, the community would remain divided, unable to function effectively, and would risk dissolving back into a state of nature. Quote 36. Every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to every one of that society to submit to the determination of the majority and to be concluded by it. This quote emphasizes the binding nature of the social contract. Once individuals consent to form a society, they are obligated to follow the decisions of the majority. This agreement ensures that society functions cohesively, with individuals sacrificing some of their personal freedom to benefit from the security and order provided by the collective will. Quote 37. Whosoever therefore out of a state of nature unite into a community must be understood to give up all the power necessary to the ends for which they unite into society to the majority of the community. Locke states that by joining a community, individuals implicitly agree to surrender their natural right to enforce laws and punish offenders. They transfer this power to the majority, which acts on behalf of the whole community. This collective power is essential for achieving the primary goals of society: security, order, and the protection of property. Quote 38. All peaceful beginnings of government have been laid in the consent of the people. Locke stresses that legitimate governments are founded on the consent of the governed. Peaceful societies are formed when individuals freely choose to enter into agreements and create governing bodies that reflect the collective will. This idea rejects the notion of inherited or divine authority, emphasizing the voluntary nature of political power. Quote 39. The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. Locke explains that the primary reason people form governments and leave the state of nature is to protect their property. This includes their lives, liberties, and possessions, which are constantly at risk in a state where there is no established authority or protection. By creating governments, people seek a system that ensures the security and stability of their belongings and rights. Quote 40. There once an established, settled, known law, received and allowed by common consent to be the standard of right and wrong, and the common measure to decide all controversies between them. Locke argues that in the state of nature, there is no universally accepted law to resolve disputes. Although natural law exists, people are biased and may interpret it to their advantage. Therefore, a formal, agreed-upon legal system is necessary in a civil society to serve as a clear and fair standard for resolving conflicts. Quote 41. In the state of nature, there wants a known and indifferent judge, with authority to determine all differences according to the established law. Locke points out that without an impartial authority, Individuals in the state of nature act as their own judges. This leads to unfair judgments due to personal bias. The creation of government provides an unbiased judge appointed by the community to fairly enforce laws and resolve disputes. Quote 42. Thus, mankind, notwithstanding all the privileges of the state of nature, being but in an ill condition while they remain in it, are quickly driven into society. Locke emphasizes that although the state of nature grants freedom, it is filled with uncertainty and insecurity, pushing people to form societies. The inconveniences and dangers of living without established laws and protection drive individuals to seek the safety and order provided by civil government. Quote 43. The power of the society, or legislative constituted by them, can never be supposed to extend farther than the common good. Locke asserts that the authority of a government, particularly its legislative power, is bound by the responsibility to serve the common good. It cannot act beyond this purpose, as people submit to government to enhance their security and well-being, not to have their freedoms arbitrarily restricted. Quote 44. The majority having, as has been showed, upon men's first uniting into society, the whole power of the community naturally in them, may employ all that power in making laws for the community from time to time, and executing those laws by officers of their own appointing. And then the form of the government is a perfect democracy. Locke explains that when people come together to form a society, they collectively hold the power to govern themselves. If they choose to retain this power and make laws directly, then the government takes the form of a democracy. In this system, the people directly appoint officers to carry out the laws they create, ensuring that the power remains with the majority. Quote 45. Or else they put the power of making laws into the hands of a few select men, and their heirs or successors, and then it is an oligarchy, or else into the hands of one man, and then it is a monarchy. Here, Locke describes the different forms of government that can arise when the legislative power is transferred from the majority to a smaller group. When the power is given to a few people, the result is an oligarchy, and when it is given to one person, it becomes a monarchy. These structures show how the legislative authority can be concentrated, depending on the will of the society. Quote 46. And so, accordingly of these, the community may make compounded and mixed forms of government, as they think good. Locke emphasizes that societies have the freedom to combine elements of different forms of government, creating mixed systems. This flexibility allows communities to structure their government in a way that best suits their needs, blending democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy in various ways to achieve stability and balance in governance. Quote 47. This legislative is not only the supreme power of the commonwealth, but sacred and unalterable in the hands where the community have once placed it. Locke asserts that once the community has vested legislative power in a specific body, that authority is both supreme and unchangeable. The legislative power cannot be overridden or altered by anyone else, as it derives its legitimacy from the consent of the people. This principle safeguards the integrity of the laws and the government itself. Quote 48. The great end of men's entering into society, being the enjoyment of their properties in peace and safety, and the great instrument and means of that being the laws established in that society. The first and fundamental positive law of all commonwealths is the establishing of the legislative power. Locke explains that people form societies to ensure the safety and enjoyment of their property. The most important tool for achieving this is the establishment of laws. Therefore, the first and most essential act in creating a commonwealth is to establish a legislative body, as it is the foundation upon which the protection of property and society rests. Quote 49. Their power, in the utmost bounds of it, is limited to the public good of the society. It is a power that hath no other end but preservation, and therefore can never have a right to destroy, enslave, or designedly to impoverish the subjects. Locke emphasizes that legislative power is bound by the principle of promoting the public good. It cannot be used to harm or oppress the people, as its purpose is to preserve society and protect the rights of individuals. Any use of power that undermines these goals is illegitimate. Quote 50. The supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. Locke asserts that the government cannot take a person's property without their consent. Since the protection of property is the primary reason people form governments, allowing the state to seize property arbitrarily would violate the very purpose of government and contradict the trust placed in it by the people. Quote 51. The legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands, for it being but a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it over to others. Locke explains that the legislative power is derived from the consent of the people, and those entrusted with it cannot delegate that authority to others. This ensures that the people maintain control over the laws that govern them, preventing any unauthorized transfer of power. Quote 52. The legislative is to govern by promulgated established laws, not to be varied in particular cases, but to have one rule for rich and poor, for the favorite at court, and the countryman at plough. Locke stresses that laws must be consistent and apply equally to all citizens, regardless of their status. This ensures fairness and prevents the abuse of power, ensuring that everyone, from the wealthiest to the most humble, is subject to the same legal standards. Quote 53. The legislative power is that which has a right to direct how the force of the Commonwealth shall be employed for preserving the community and the members of it. Locke asserts that the legislative power is responsible for deciding how the resources and strength of the society should be used to protect both the community as a whole and its individual members. This power is essential to ensuring the stability and security of the Commonwealth. Quote 54. The same persons who have the power of making laws, to have also in their hands the power to execute them, whereby they may exempt themselves from obedience to the laws they make, and suit the law, both in its making and execution, to their own private advantage. Locke warns against allowing those who make laws to also enforce them, as it creates the potential for abuse of power. When the same individuals hold both powers, they may manipulate laws for their personal benefit and avoid accountability, undermining the fairness and purpose of government. Quote 55. Therefore, in well-ordered commonwealths, where the good of the whole is so considered as it ought, the legislative power is put into the hands of divers persons. Being separated again, they are themselves subject to the laws they have made. Locke explains that in a properly functioning commonwealth, the legislative power is divided among different individuals or groups. Once laws are created, the legislators are subject to the very laws they have made. This separation ensures accountability and prevents those in power from acting solely in their own interest. Quote 56. There is another power in every commonwealth, which one may call natural, because it is that which answers to the power every man naturally had before he entered into society. Locke introduces the federative power, which governs a commonwealth's interactions with other states and external parties. This power reflects the natural authority individuals had before forming societies, managing foreign relations and defending the community's interests on a global scale. Quote 57. Though the executive and federative power of every community be really distinct in themselves, yet they are hardly to be separated, and placed at the same time, in the hands of distinct persons. Locke explains that while the executive and federative powers are distinct in nature, they are often unified in practice. Separating these powers into different hands would complicate the exercise of the community's force, leading to potential conflicts and disorder within the Commonwealth. Quote 58. The legislative being only a fiduciary power to act for certain ends, there remains still in the people a supreme power to remove or alter the legislative, when they find the legislative act contrary to the trust reposed in them. Locke explains that the legislative power, entrusted with governing for specific purposes, is not absolute. If the legislative body violates the trust given to it by the people retain the ultimate authority to remove or change it. This ensures that the legislative serves the public good and remains accountable to the citizens who granted it power. Quote 59. For all power given with trust for the attaining an end, being limited by that end, whenever that end is manifestly neglected or opposed, the trust must necessarily be forfeited, and the power devolve into the hands of those that gave it. Locke emphasizes that power is conditional upon fulfilling its intended purpose. If the legislative or any governing body neglects or actively works against the purpose for which it was established, the people who granted that power have the right to reclaim it. This ensures that the government cannot stray from its foundational purpose of serving the people. Quote 60. The legislative must needs be the supreme, and all other powers, in any members or parts of the society, derived from and subordinate to it. Locke affirms that in a functioning commonwealth, the legislative power holds the highest authority, with all other governmental powers subordinate to it. This hierarchy ensures that all actions within the government are aligned with the laws established by the legislative, maintaining order and coherence in the execution of laws. Quote 61. The executive power, placed anywhere but in a person that has also a share in the legislative, is visibly subordinate and accountable to it, and may be at pleasure changed and displaced. Locke explains that when the executive power is held by someone outside the legislative body, it is subordinate and accountable to the legislative. The legislative retains the right to change or remove the executive if necessary, maintaining control over how laws are enforced and ensuring that the executive operates in accordance with the law. Quote 62. In all states and conditions, the true remedy of force without authority is to oppose force to it. The use of force without authority always puts him that uses it into a state of war as the aggressor and renders him liable to be treated accordingly. Locke argues that when force is used without legitimate authority, it constitutes an act of aggression, effectively creating a state of war. The appropriate response to such unjustified force is to resist it, as those who use force without authority have violated the principles of law and governance, making them liable to opposition. Quote 63. This power to act according to discretion for the public good without the prescription of the law, and sometimes even against it, is that which is called prerogative. Locke defines prerogative as the ability of a ruler to act outside or even contrary to the law when necessary for the public good. This discretionary power is important when the law does not provide clear guidance, allowing the ruler to make decisions that benefit the people and maintain societal order. Quote 64. Prerogative being nothing but a power, in the hands of the prince, to provide for the public good in such cases, which, depending upon unforeseen and uncertain occurrences, certain and unalterable laws could not safely direct. Locke emphasizes that prerogative exists to address situations that laws cannot foresee or manage effectively. It grants rulers the flexibility to act in the best interest of society, especially when strict adherence to the law would be impractical or harmful in unexpected circumstances. Quote 65. For the end of government, being the preservation of all, as much as may be, even the guilty are to be spared, where it can prove no prejudice to the innocent. Locke explains that the ultimate purpose of government is to preserve life and promote the common good. In cases where strict enforcement of the law would harm individuals unnecessarily, rulers should use their prerogative to mitigate the law's severity, balancing justice with mercy. Quote 66. It is fit that the laws themselves should in some cases give way to the executive power, or rather to this fundamental law of nature and government, viz., that as much as may be, all the members of the society are to be preserved. Locke argues that when necessary, even established laws should yield to the executive's discretion if doing so upholds the fundamental law of nature, which is the preservation of society and its members. This ensures that the government prioritizes the well-being of its people above rigid legal constraints. Quote 67. When their successors, managing the government with different thoughts, would draw the actions of those good rulers into precedent and make them the standard of their prerogative, as if what had been done only for the good of the people was a right in them to do, for the harm of the people. Locke warns that future rulers may misuse the prerogative exercised by their predecessors. What was originally used for the public good might be misinterpreted as a right to harm the people. This highlights the potential dangers of relying on precedent without considering the intent behind the actions of past rulers. Quote 68. Paternal or parental power is nothing but that which parents have over their children, to govern them for the children's good, till they come to the use of reason or a state of knowledge, wherein they may be supposed capable to understand that rule. Locke clarifies that parental power is temporary and is exercised for the benefit of children until they reach the age of reason. This power is meant to nurture, guide, and protect children, but it does not extend to life and death control, nor does it continue once the child becomes capable of self-governance. Quote 69. Political power is that power, which every man having in the state of nature has given up into the hands of the society, and therein to the governors, whom the society hath set over itself, with this express or tacit trust, that it shall be employed for their good, and the preservation of their property. Locke defines political power as the authority individuals in the state of nature surrender to society for collective governance. This power is entrusted to rulers with the expectation that it will be used to protect the people's rights and property, ensuring the well-being of the entire community. Despotic. Quote 70. Political power is an absolute arbitrary power one man has over another to take away his life whenever he pleases. This is a power which neither nature gives, for it has made no such distinction between one man and another, nor compact can convey. Locke explains despotical power as the arbitrary control of one person over another's life. He argues that this type of power is unnatural and cannot be justified by any compact or agreement, as no individual has the right to surrender their life to the will of another. Quote 71. He that is master of himself and his own life has a right too to the means of preserving it, so that as soon as compact enters, slavery ceases, and he so far quits his absolute power and puts an end to the state of war. Locke highlights that once a person enters into an agreement or compact, they regain their autonomy. This marks the end of absolute despotical power, as the individual, by agreeing to terms, leaves behind a state of war and recovers the rights to their own life and freedom. Quote 72. Paternal power is only where minority makes the child incapable to manage his property. Political, where men have property in their own disposal, and despotical over such as have no property at all. Locke distinguishes between the three types of power by their relationship to property. Parental power applies only to minors who cannot manage their property. Political power governs free individuals with control over their property, and despotical power affects those who have lost all property and rights. Quote 73. But conquest is as far from setting up any government as demolishing an house is from building a new one in the place. Locke argues that conquest alone cannot establish a legitimate government. While it may destroy an existing political system, true government requires the consent of the people. Conquest only clears the way for a new government to be formed, but it cannot create a lawful government on its own without the people's agreement. Quote 74. The injury and the crime is equal, whether committed by the wearer of a crown or some petty villain. The title of the offender and the number of his followers make no difference in the offense. Locke emphasizes that acts of injustice, whether carried out by a monarch or a common criminal, are equally wrong. A conqueror or ruler does not gain legitimacy by the size of his army or his title if his actions are unjust. The same moral standards apply regardless of the perpetrator's status. Quote 75. He that conquers in an unjust war can thereby have no title to the subjection and obedience of the conquered. Locke makes clear that victory in an unjust war does not grant the conqueror the right to rule over those he has defeated. A conquest founded on injustice provides no legal or moral basis for demanding obedience or loyalty from the conquered people. Quote 76. The power a conqueror gets over those he overcomes in a just war is perfectly despotical. He has an absolute power over the lives of those who, by putting themselves in a state of war, have forfeited them. Locke explains that in a just war, the conqueror gains absolute power over the lives of those who actively engaged in unjust aggression. Their participation in an unjust war results in the forfeiture of their lives, allowing the conqueror to exercise despotical power over them. Quote 77. He that by conquest has a right over a man's person to destroy him if he pleases, has not thereby a right over his estate to possess and enjoy it. Locke argues that even if a conqueror has the right to take a person's life due to a just war, this does not extend to the person's property. The right of conquest over life does not automatically translate into the right to seize possessions, as property rights are distinct and must be respected. Quote 78. As conquest may be called a foreign usurpation, so usurpation is a kind of domestic conquest, with this difference that an usurper can never have right on his side, it being no usurpation, but where one is got into the possession of what another has right to. Locke explains that while conquest can be seen as an external form of usurpation, usurpation occurs within a society when someone unlawfully seizes power or authority that belongs to another. Unlike conquest, usurpation is always unjust because it involves taking something that rightfully belongs to someone else within the established order of the society. Quote 79. This, so far as it is usurpation, is a change only of persons, but not of the forms and rules of the government. For if the usurper extend his power beyond what of right belonged to the lawful princes, or governors of the commonwealth, it is tyranny added to usurpation. Locke clarifies that usurpation involves changing the person in power, not altering the form or structure of the government. However, when an usurper exceeds the limits of power that were rightfully held by the lawful rulers, it becomes tyranny, which is even worse than usurpation itself. Quote 80. In all lawful governments, the designation of the persons who are to bear rule is as natural and necessary a part as the form of the government itself, and is that which had its establishment originally from the people. Locke stresses that the lawful appointment of rulers is as important as the government's structure itself. The authority to govern comes from the people, and without a legitimate process to choose rulers, a society would be in a state of anarchy, even if the form of government remains intact. Quote 81. Whoever gets into the exercise of any part of the power, by other ways than what the laws of the community have prescribed, hath no right to be obeyed, though the form of the commonwealth be still preserved. Locke argues that anyone who assumes power through illegitimate means, outside the legal framework set by the community, has no rightful claim to authority. Even if the government's form remains unchanged, an unlawful ruler does not deserve the obedience of the people because their rule lacks legal and moral legitimacy. Quote 82. Nor can such an usurper, or any deriving from him, ever have a title, till the people are both at liberty to consent, and have actually consented to allow, and confirm in him the power he hath till then usurped. Locke asserts that no usurper can gain a legitimate title to power unless the people are free to choose, and they voluntarily consent to grant authority to the usurper. Without the people's explicit consent, the usurper's hold on power remains unlawful and invalid. Quote 83. Tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which no body can have a right to. and this is making use of the power anyone has in his hands, not for the good of those who are under it, but for his own private separate advantage. Locke defines tyranny as the abuse of power, where a ruler uses authority for personal gain rather than the welfare of the people. Tyranny occurs when the ruler's actions are driven by selfish motives such as ambition, revenge, or greed, rather than the preservation of the people's rights and property. Quote 84. Wherever law ends, tyranny begins, if the law be transgressed to another's harm. And whosoever in authority exceeds the power given him by the law, and makes use of the force he has under his command, to compass that upon the subject, which the law allows not, ceases in that to be a magistrate. Locke asserts that tyranny begins when a ruler acts outside the boundaries of the law to harm others. When an authority figure uses power in a way not permitted by law, they cease to be a legitimate ruler and become a tyrant, making it lawful to resist their actions as one would resist an unjust aggressor. Quote 85. May the commands, then, of a prince be opposed? May he be resisted as often as anyone shall find himself aggrieved, and but imagine he has not right done him. This will unhinge and overturn all polities, and, instead of government and order, leave nothing but anarchy and confusion. Locke acknowledges the concern that allowing people to resist unlawful commands might lead to chaos and anarchy. However, he clarifies that resistance is only justified against unjust force that violates the law, not for every personal grievance, ensuring that government and order are preserved while tyrannical overreach is resisted. Quote 86. But if all the world shall observe pretenses of one kind, and actions of another, arts used to elude the law, and the trust of prerogative employed contrary to the end for which it was given. If the people shall find the ministers and subordinate magistrates chosen suitable to such ends, and favored or laid by, proportionably as they promote or oppose them, how can a man any more hinder himself from being persuaded in his own mind which way things are going? Locke explains that when people observe rulers manipulating the law for personal gain and appointing officials who support such abuses, it becomes evident that the government is heading towards tyranny. In such cases, individuals cannot help but recognize the danger to their rights and freedoms, prompting them to consider resistance. Quote 87. The king's authority being given him only by the law, he cannot empower anyone to act against the law, or justify him by his commission in so doing. Locke emphasizes that a ruler's authority is derived from the law, and therefore a king or any authority figure cannot grant permission to violate the law. If a ruler or their officials act outside the law, their actions are illegitimate, and they cannot claim legal or moral justification for such conduct. Quote 88. That which makes the community, and brings men out of the loose state of nature, into one politic society, is the agreement which everyone has with the rest to incorporate, and act as one body, and so be one distinct commonwealth. Locke explains that the formation of a political society arises from the mutual agreement among individuals to unite and act as a single entity. This collective decision marks the shift from the state of nature to a structured society, where the members agree to be governed by common laws and principles. Quote 89. When the legislative is broken or dissolved, dissolution and death follows. For the essence and union of the society consisting in having one will, the legislative, when once established by the majority, has the declaring, and as it were keeping of that will. Locke emphasizes the importance of the legislative body as the core of societal unity. The legislative represents the collective will of the people, and when it is disrupted or dissolved, the society loses its cohesion, leading to its eventual collapse. Quote 90. When other laws are set up and other rules pretended and enforced than what the legislative, constituted by the society, have enacted, it is plain that the legislative is changed. Locke explains that any attempt to impose new laws or rules outside the authority of the established legislative body constitutes a fundamental change in the government. This action undermines the legitimate power of the legislative and disrupts the legal foundation of the society. Quote 91. The reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property, and the end why they choose and authorize a legislative is that there may be laws made and rules set as guards and fences to the properties of all the members of the society. Locke reiterates that the primary purpose of forming a society and establishing a legislative is to protect property rights. Laws and rules are created to safeguard the property, liberties, and well-being of individuals, ensuring that their rights are preserved within the societal framework. Quote 92. Whenever the society is dissolved, it is certain the government of that society cannot remain. That being as impossible as for the frame of an house to subsist when the materials of it are scattered and dissipated by a whirlwind. Locke emphasizes that when a society disbands, its government inevitably falls apart. Just as a house cannot stand when its materials are scattered, a government cannot function without the unity of the society that created it. The government relies on the cohesion of the people it governs, and without that, it collapses. Quote 93. Whosoever uses force without right, as everyone does in society, who does it without law, puts himself into a state of war with those against whom he so uses it. Locke states that using force outside the boundaries of the law constitutes an act of war. Any person or authority who engages in unlawful force against others effectively declares a state of war, nullifying previous legal or social ties, and the individuals attacked have the right to defend themselves against such aggression. Quote 94. The people have a right to resist and defend themselves from injury, but it must be with this caution, that they only defend themselves, but do not attack their prince. Locke explains that while the people have the right to resist a tyrannical ruler, they must exercise caution and limit their resistance to self-defense. They are allowed to protect themselves from harm, but should not seek revenge or pursue aggressive actions against their ruler. Quote 95. The power that every individual gave the society when he entered into it can never revert to the individuals again, as long as the society lasts, but will always remain in the community. Locke clarifies that once individuals give up their personal power to form a society, that power stays with the community as long as the society exists. It cannot revert to individual control unless the society dissolves or the government fails, in which case the people can reclaim their power and re-establish governance. Second Treatise of Government by John Locke concludes with a powerful reminder of the purpose and limitations of government. Locke emphasizes that government exists only to preserve the natural rights of individuals, life, liberty, and property, and that any ruler or government that fails to do so loses its legitimacy and may be justly resisted. He argues for the separation of powers and asserts that people retain the right to dissolve a government that acts against their common interest. Locke's vision of a just society, rooted in the balance of individual freedoms and the rule of law, provides a foundational argument for liberal democracy, and has continued to inspire political movements advocating liberty and justice.
Curious to dive into the mind of John Locke? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Second Treatise of Government in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.